some of the kids who were on stimulants from early in age, by the time I might be working with them in college age, they're really having, they have sleep disruption issues. They're up and they're down. So it's kind of like the caffeine and the Adderall, or the wine, beer, or whatever else, and Ambien at the end of the day. And I'm thinking, like, holy moly, like, you're 20 years old and it's I'm up, I'm down. And it's like, what are you going to do when you're 40? What are you going to do when you're 55? And at the rate we're going, when you're 55, you'll have a 5-year-old. Like, because we keep having our first kids later and later in life. And that also has everything to do with the accumulated body burden we have at that point, not to mention like old eggs and old sperm and the influence of all of that then on immune and neurological outcomes. So it's like, I'm thinking how I'm just seeing burnout at a younger and younger age.
Welcome back, everyone. It's Mike Mutzel here with HighIntensityHealth.com. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We're live with Geri Brewster. She's a registered dietitian and expert when it comes to children's health, preconception planning, and she's been doing this work for over 30 plus years. I want to tell you where she's been featured. She's been featured on CNN, CBS, WOR, WNEW, Disney Radio, Wall Street Journal Radio, Martha Stewart Radio, and other stations in the New York City area. And so she's going to give us insights into her 30-year career, helping people better improve their diet. So, Geri, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Mike. It's a pleasure to be with you. You're doing amazing work and bringing lots of great information to your audience. As you mentioned, I started in the area of pediatric developmental disabilities kind of back in the day, the very early 80s. And at that time, it was, significant for genetic disorders, Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, and other conditions where feeding was a real challenge. So a lot of kids with very specialized dietary needs, a lot of tube feedings, kids with tracheostomies, and just what it really took to support them biologically and help them reach their growth and developmental potential, and support the family as a whole, because when it came to the feeding side, that's such a personal issue, and everybody wants to be able to nourish their children with food and eating by mouth. So a lot of the tube feeders, that was a challenge to have parents and mothers especially appreciate that they're still providing the best nourishment and yet still provide like oral motor stimulation and care to help develop language and articulation and optimize the swallow reflex should we be able to integrate oral feeds on top of the tube feeding. So it was quite an intense orientation into the area of clinical nutrition when I began.
Fantastic. And you did work with Dr. Robert Atkins, is that right?
Yeah, a little further down, about 10 or 15 years into my career, because ultimately working with chronically ill children and then supporting the families and even the, say, neurotypical siblings, the idea of just preventive care. So Dr. Atkins, well, everyone knows of him as the diet doctor, the ketogenic or the low-carb diet. He really was very instrumental in promoting integrative or alternative care, as it was considered then. He had started the Foundation for the Advancement of Integrative Medicine. So he was very much into vitamin and supplementation regimens and even IV vitamin protocols. And many years prior, my mother, who had multiple sclerosis, she had gone down to the Atkins Center and had seen the very well-known and well-regarded Dr. Carlton Fredericks, who was his clinical nutritionist at the time. And he was a nutritional biochemist and spoke for many years about how the sugars and refined carbohydrates and sodas that were entering our food supply were ultimately going to be responsible for diabetes and obesity and chronic disease epidemic, which in fact came true. And at that time, he was very much poo-pooed, as was Dr. Atkins, this notion that that sugar is actually going to cause diabetes, when conventionally it was just looked at that sugars, that a sugar is a sugar, and that we can metabolize it, and that diabetes was this error of metabolism, of carbohydrate metabolism, as if the information that food delivered had absolutely nothing to do with the manifestation of disease. It sounds so archaic, right, to say this now, and it was only a generation ago when I was growing up, and yet now we've come full circle, as I came full circle then in my lifetime, to actually serve as director of nutrition at the Atkins Center under Dr. Atkins, which was a real honor. It was great to work with him. And at that time, there was much more in the literature in terms of the benefits of a lower carb lifestyle. I think that some of the scrutiny he came under was just really the push on in terms of the saturated fats, but that would be a whole other show in and of itself. But needless to say, I think we've really found the benefits epidemiologically to be in a very carb-controlled Mediterranean type of diet ultimately. So, he has been really validated in the scientific literature over the years. But in the wake of how we have come to eat as a society, and all the post-World War II adulteration of our food supply, with all the excess of genetically modified grains and soy that wound up in our food supply, and even the cottonseed oil, we don't eat cotton, but yet the oil, any byproduct of industry that wasn't going to ultimately kill you immediately, could wind up in our food supply. Which has led to all of this inflammation and big shifts in our microbiome, right, our gut microbiome. I mean, we use this language, and you interview some amazing people that are really at the precipice and forefront of this research and bringing this information out to everyone. And yet, it's all been so recent. I mean, the human genome study was just done in 2003. And prior to that, everybody thought your genes are hardwired. There was nothing that you could really do about that. It's if your grandmother had diabetes, you were going to have diabetes kind of thing. And then we're still in the midst of the microbiome study, which is really due to be completed, I think, this year. The first part of it was on identifying the trillions of various pathogens, biologicals, good and bad bacteria that we house all over our body, but primarily in our gut. And then the second part, how all of that influences disease, right? So when you look at then this new information, and yet the adulteration of our food supply, and all of even the toxic body burden within that food supply, all the animals and the antibiotics and steroids, again, all post-World War II, which have been life-saving, but nobody was really looking at the downstream effects of dumping all this into our bodies, because we didn't even really know the microbiome was existing, right? We didn't know how malleable our genes were. And now suddenly we have all this adulterated food, which is providing all this information to our microbiome, which is influencing our genetic expression. So now we have all this transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, and suddenly everything's through the roof. Neurological diseases are through the roof. It's autism spectrum disorders. I think it was just it was probably just, I think, a year or so ago that a senior researcher from MIT talked about how by 2025, 1 in 2 children will have some autism spectrum disorder, some whether it's an inability to make eye contact or relate socially, whether it's either going to come about from cognitive manifestations or social manifestations, or even immunological, because we know a lot of children on the spectrum have various immunological problems. And then you also do have the fact that allergies and asthma are so much on the rise. So right now our whole immune systems and neurological systems are moving targets.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all because of everything that's happened, I believe, to our food supply, which is then changing out what's happening within our own bodies. And then we are now the vehicles for the next generation. So now we're already into these generations of children. I mean, these rises started in the 90s. So now there are people that are, born in the 90s, early 90s, that are getting ready to have children, if not now, in another 10 years. Mm-hmm. So because I've been in this for over 30 years, and you can take this big sort of, like a rolling stone, all this information, and have worked with families and can see the trends, it's a little frightening, because I always take a family history. So you can look at the family history in terms of disease potential that's there, maternal and paternal. But then you look at the individuals and you see, wow, okay, so now this was the child who was the refluxer and who was constipated, who had eczema and allergies, who was, who's now like met the young, this is the young woman. And so then she developed PCOS, and now she's meeting the young man who was on the inhaler and the stimulant in order to attend, and then wound up on an antidepressant. And then let's not forget about all just the social drug use and other toxins that we knowingly participate in that get layered on. And then maybe really not the best diet sources. I mean, because again, we have to think about the processing. We live in such an instant gratification world, and that really starts with our food. So everything's about convenience and processing. And sometimes I look at like all the processed organic foods a little bit like light cigarettes, right? So we have to be, it's better, but it's still very processed. So, and that's even when things are good, if they're having like sort of organic processed foods. But if they've been sort of just having a standard American diet, we talk about trans fats, it's if they've been, so far gone, oh, they're horrible. Just like smoking on airplanes, that's horrible. It's not such ancient history. It was just a few years ago. So, these are kids, young adults now, that have these big neurological and immunological histories themselves. They are the products of mothers who grew up on trans fats and high fructose corn syrup, which we know what it does from an inflammatory standpoint. We know now that we're adding to our prenatals and our infant formulas and our early baby foods fats and compounds that were once part of our usual diet that completely got knocked out of the picture, between the DHA from the egg yolk. We were in an egg phobic society, the choline that's in egg yolk. You've got, serine and all that, like from liver and organ meat. So all of that was so absent. So how much does that alone have to do with that? A lot of the children didn't have these foundational building blocks themselves coming into this world. So then they're kind of all inflamed, and then they've all been on pharmaceuticals and the whole pharmacogenetics, how drugs even influence our genetic expression, right? So we talk about the toxins influencing them, but in essence, drugs are like a controlled toxin in many ways, right? Mm-hmm. And then we're having fewer nutrients. Nutrients have everything to do, of course, with even helping our metabolism and our detoxification of some of these compounds. Goes on and on. So the point is that now when you sort of have very nutritionally deficient and very epigenetically skewed young individuals who in another 10 years from now are going to go on to procreate, what will be those outcomes? And this is why it's become exponential in terms of the endocrine disruption, the immune disruption, and our neurological disruptions, just the anxiety-prone aspects of our society at this point. Everybody's on adrenaline, overdrive.
Sure.
So it's so depressing, right? But it can be turned around by kind of really taking back our food supply and our detoxification pathways, by really looking at how to be a little bit more nutrient centric, and really looking at the quality of our food and eating seasonally and allowing our immune system to kind of calm down in a way, and support our gastrointestinal tracts, because it's really our gut that's that biggest interface between the external environment and our internal bodies. And then what's always getting delivered into our gut is our food. So that's the vehicle for all that information. So, right now our immune systems are so hyper reactive. We're attacking everything. It's kind of hard to determine what is going to be compatible with our bodies and what isn't, right? So our body just attacks everything. So the anaphylactic reaction to foods is kind of crazy, benign, what were once considered benign proteins, the body's now attacking. And then that neurological hyper reactivity, the ADHD, the anxiety disorders, the agitation, the inability to, the sensory integration disorders, the inability to be able to attend to a conversation without either being extremely distracted by an external stimuli or reacting to it in an agitated way.
Mm-hmm. Gosh,
so
beautifully
our
said right there.
kids are really suffering. I mean, children are really suffering these days.
Right. Yeah. I like how you illustrated the trajectory there of illness. We kind of, how you talked about from, the parents that ate all the, and I was a child of this, right, where low fat was in the 80s and the 90s and so forth. And so, and then these kids have health problems related to their parents' diets. And so the epigenetics is not really that favorable. And we learned, a lot of our listeners are familiar with the work of, Pottinger and so forth. And we know that, with cats, like we saw this happen at the turn of the century. But so Geri, you hit on the gut a lot. And so let's kind of, before we kind of talk at the end about calming down the inflammatory inferno in our immune system, let's talk about the gut. And when we were talking about, Dr. Atkins and the carbohydrates and when we think of like insulin resistance now, we know that really starts in the gut. And we know that bariatric surgery, the way that it causes rapid weight loss is by changing the composition of the gut. But in the context specifically in ADHD and autism and neurologic disorders, you talk about how when children eat carbohydrates, they increase the level of the bacterial production of a short-chain fatty acid propionate. So do you want to talk about like why sugar above and beyond the high glycemic index is so problematic for children and attention?
Right. So the work of Dr. Derek McFabe from Ontario, specific to propionic acid, and it was in Cherry Hill at a Defeat Autism Now conference that he first presented that work. I believe it was in, time goes by so quickly, I don't know, the late 2000s or so. And subsequently, again,